There is a man about whom almost no verifiable portrait exists. No authenticated likeness. No written account from his own hand. What survives instead are the economic consequences he left behind. Disruptions so significant, so measurable, that they appear in the trade records and diplomatic correspondence of 3 continents. His name was Musa Keita. The world would come to call him Mansa Musa, Mansa meaning, roughly, King of Kings. He is widely identified by economic historians as the wealthiest individual in recorded history. Not wealthy by the modest standards of medieval Europe. Not wealthy in the way that empires sometimes appear wealthy, on paper, in potential. Wealthy in a way that was immediate, portable, and impossible to ignore. In 1324, he left his capital and walked toward Mecca. And in doing so, he may have caused one of the most instructive monetary crises of the pre-modern world. The paradox at the center of this story is precise and worth stating clearly. Can wealth be so vast that the act of spending it becomes economically destructive? The answer, it turns out, is yes. And Mansa Musa proved it. To understand what Mansa Musa possessed, one must first understand the geography of wealth in the 14th century. The Mali Empire, at its height, occupied a territory comparable in scale to Western Europe. It stretched from the Atlantic coast eastward across the interior of the continent, encompassing the headwaters of the Senegal and Niger rivers and, crucially, controlling the overland arteries that connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world. These were the trans-Saharan trade routes. 4 centuries before Musa's reign, gold and salt had moved along these corridors, south to north, north to south, in a trade so consistent and so massive that it structured the economics of the entire medieval world above the equator. Salt, mined in the Saharan interior at places like Tagaza, was worth its weight in gold in the markets of the south, where it was scarce and essential. Gold, extracted from the alluvial deposits of regions like Bambouk and Boré, deposits so rich that medieval Arab geographers wrote of gold growing from the earth like plants, moved northward to Egypt, to the Maghreb, to the Mediterranean merchants who supplied it onward to Europe. The Mali Empire did not merely participate in this trade. It controlled the choke points. The empire's rulers taxed goods passing through their territory, levied duties on the salt mines, and, most significantly, monopolized the gold trade at its source. The economist Nehemiah Levsian, one of the foremost scholars of medieval West Africa, estimated that Mali may have accounted for roughly half of the Old World's gold supply during this period. This is not a figure to absorb quickly. Half of the world's known gold. Europe in the 14th century was experiencing a chronic gold shortage, a monetary famine that constrained trade, limited coinage, and stunted economic growth. The gold that did circulate in European markets, in the currencies of Florence, Genoa, and Venice, largely originated in West Africa. The Florentine florin, the instrument of Renaissance commerce, was minted from African gold. The Mali Empire was not peripheral to the medieval world economy. It was, in measurable terms, its financial foundation. Musa Keita came to power around 1312, following the departure of his predecessor, Abu Bakr II, who had reportedly set sail westward across the Atlantic with a fleet of thousands and never returned. The story is almost certainly apocryphal in its details, and historians continue to debate its meaning, but it establishes something true about the Mali Empire at the moment Musa assumed control. It was a state so wealthy, so confident in its resources, that its rulers could contemplate adventures of oceanic scale. Musa consolidated power with evident competence. He expanded the empire's territorial reach, standardized aspects of its administration, and deepened its relationships with the Islamic scholarly world, relationships that would define his legacy as much as his wealth. He was a devout Muslim, educated in Islamic theology and jurisprudence, and he governed a court that included scholars, jurists, and architects drawn from across the Islamic world. The historian Ibn Khaldun, writing in the late 14th century, described Musa as a ruler of exceptional piety and generosity, qualities that would, as we shall see, carry precise economic consequences. His wealth was not abstract. It was structural. The empire's gold revenues flowed into the royal treasury through taxation, tribute, and direct control of mining regions. There was no central bank, no bond market, no mechanism for distributing this wealth across a population in the modern sense. It accumulated, in granaries, in treasury rooms, in the form of gold dust and gold bars, in the jewelry and ornamentation of the court, in the hands of one man. The historian Rudolph has noted that in pre-modern African empires, the distinction between state wealth and royal personal wealth was frequently blurred or non-existent. What belonged to the Mali Empire belonged, in a functional sense, to Mansa Musa. And what Mansa Musa chose to do with it was, ultimately, a personal decision. In 1324, he decided to go to Mecca. The primary source for what followed is the account of Al-Amari, Ahmad ibn Yahya ibn Fadl Allah Al-Amari, an Egyptian scholar and administrator who interviewed witnesses and officials in Cairo approximately 12 years after the events he describes. Al-Amari was not present. This matters. His account is mediated, filtered through the recollections of men who were, at the time of his writing, attempting to reconstruct events that had astonished them. With that caveat firmly in place, what Al-Amari records is this: Mansa Musa departed from Mecca with a retinue estimated at between 60,000 and 80,000 people. This figure is almost certainly inflated. Medieval chroniclers frequently exaggerated the scale of great processions, but even at a fraction of that number, the caravan would have been among the largest organized movements of people in the medieval world. The caravan included soldiers, servants, scholars, and administrators. It included Musa's personal household, his wives, his children, his court. It included hundreds of camels, each reportedly carrying between 300 and 500 pounds of gold dust. It also included something more deliberate, an advance guard of 500 enslaved men, each reportedly carrying a golden staff. These were not soldiers. They were a visual statement. They were the opening sentence of a proclamation that Mansa Musa was making to every city, every court, every merchant he encountered on the route northward. The proclamation was simple: I am incomprehensibly rich, and I want you to know it. The route took the caravan through the Sahara, a journey of several months, through the trading cities of the north, and eventually into Egypt. At each stopping point, Musa distributed gold. This was partly a religious obligation. Almsgiving, or zakat, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and a ruler of Musa's piety would have taken this seriously. It was partly political. Generosity was a language of power, and Musa was speaking it with the fluency of a man who had never encountered its limits. And it was partly, perhaps, theatrical. Musa understood, as powerful rulers throughout history have understood, that wealth is not merely an economic resource. It is a communicative act. Every gift he gave was a message. Every bag of gold distributed to a mosque, every sum pressed into the hand of a scholar, every donation to a local sovereign's treasury was Mansa Musa writing his name in the economic memory of a region. The caravan reached Cairo in 1324. And there, the economics became impossible to ignore. Cairo in 1324 was one of the most sophisticated cities in the world. Under Mamluk rule, it was a commercial and intellectual capital, a node in trade networks that extended from India to the Mediterranean, a city accustomed to wealth, to commerce, to the spectacle of powerful visitors. It was not prepared for Mansa Musa. Al-Amari records that Musa entered Cairo in a manner that strained the descriptive capacities of those who witnessed it. His procession halted the city. He was received by the Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, and the meeting between the two rulers was, by several accounts, tense. Musa, a man of such extraordinary wealth that he had difficulty performing the genuflections of diplomatic protocol without appearing to condescend, regardless of his intentions. But the diplomatic courtesies are not what history recorded most clearly. What history recorded was what happened to the gold market. During his stay in Cairo, which lasted several months, Mansa Musa spent. He spent lavishly, freely, and with what Alamari describes as a generosity bordering on the indiscriminate. He gave gold to the poor along the streets. He paid above market rates for goods and services. Whether from ignorance of local prices or deliberate magnanimity, the sources do not clearly say. He purchased property. His retinue spent independently, thousands of people each with access to gold, each transacting across the city's markets. He gave so much gold to the mosques of Cairo that Alamari's sources recalled it decades later with a mixture of awe and something approaching economic horror. What Mansa Musa had done, measured in the language of modern monetary economics, was inject a massive, sudden, and uncontrolled increase in the money supply into a single urban economy. The mechanism is not complicated, and it is worth explaining precisely. Gold in the medieval world was not simply a commodity. It was money, the physical substrate of currency. When Mansa Musa distributed gold in Cairo, he was not merely giving people wealth in the abstract. He was increasing the amount of money in circulation within the city and its surrounding region. When the supply of money in a market increases faster than the supply of goods and services, prices rise. This is inflation. Not the gradual, moderate inflation that characterizes healthy growing economies, but sudden, sharp, disorienting inflation driven not by increased economic activity but by a monetary shock. Cairo's merchants had stocks of goods, cloth, spices, grain, metalwork, animals, property. These stocks did not multiply because Mansa Musa arrived. But the money available to purchase them did. Suddenly, dramatically, within weeks. The result was predictable to anyone with a model of how money works. Prices rose. The purchasing power of gold already held by Cairo's residents, gold they had earned through years of trade, gold they depended on for daily transactions, fell. Their savings were worth less. Their wages, if denominated in gold, bought fewer goods than they had the month before. Mansa Musa had, in modern terminology, caused inflation. Not through malice. Not through policy. Through the simple act of being extraordinarily generous with an extraordinarily large fortune. The relationship between the supply of money and the value of that money is one of the oldest observations in economic thought. The philosopher and historian Ibn Khaldun, who wrote about the Mali Empire from first-hand knowledge of North African trade, understood, in qualitative terms, that the abundance of a thing diminishes its worth. What he was describing was what economists would later formalize as the quantity theory of money. The logic is intuitive when examined carefully. Consider a closed market, a city, a region, in which 10 units of gold are in circulation, and 10 loaves of bread are available for purchase. In equilibrium, 1 loaf costs 1 gold unit. Now introduce 10 additional gold units, without adding any bread. The ratio has changed. 20 gold units now chase 10 loaves. The price settles, naturally, at 2 gold units per loaf. The bread has not become more valuable. The gold has become less valuable, because there is more of it. Mansa Musa did not add a modest increment to Cairo's gold supply. He flooded it. The historian John Hunwick, one of the most rigorous scholars of West African Islamic history, characterized the disruption in Cairo as a genuine monetary crisis, not merely an episode of elevated prices, but a structural derangement of the city's commercial relationships. Alamari's account states plainly that the price of goods and services in Cairo rose sharply during and after Musa's stay, and that this elevated price level persisted for approximately 12 years after his departure. 12 years. This is not the signature of a temporary disturbance. This is an economy that was recalibrated, reset to a higher price level, and then had to grow its way back to stability. The historian Nehemiah Levsian estimated that Musa may have distributed somewhere in the range of 12 to 18 tons of gold during the journey. Other scholars place the figure lower. None place it significantly higher. Even at conservative estimates, the quantity was extraordinary relative to existing monetary stocks in the regions he traversed. There is a modern parallel that is structurally useful here, and it is worth being precise about where the parallel holds and where it breaks down. Central banks in the 21st century engage in a practice known as quantitative easing, the large-scale purchase of financial assets using newly created money to stimulate economic activity during periods of contraction. The mechanism, at its core, involves increasing the supply of money in circulation. The debates among economists about quantitative easing, whether it causes inflation, whether it distorts asset prices, whether it creates systemic vulnerabilities, echo, in a different register, what Cairo experienced in 1324. The parallel is imperfect in important ways. Modern central banks operate within frameworks of policy, theory, and accountability. They can reverse their interventions. Mansa Musa had no mechanism for reversal. He was not implementing a policy. He was on a journey. And yet the structural logic is the same. When a large quantity of money enters a market faster than that market can absorb it through expanded production, prices rise. The money supply shock that Mansa Musa delivered to Cairo was, in its basic mechanics, what economists today recognize as a monetary stimulus, except delivered not by institutional design but by the private generosity of a single individual. The cases of hyperinflation that the 20th century produced, Weimar Germany in the early 1920s, Zimbabwe in the 2000s, Venezuela more recently, are not direct parallels. These involved governments printing currency without constraint, driven by debt, political crisis, and the collapse of productive capacity. Musa's disruption was different in kind. He did not create new gold. He redistributed existing gold, suddenly and massively. The disruption was severe but bounded. Cairo recovered. It took over a decade, but it recovered. What Cairo could not recover quickly was the lost purchasing power of its existing gold holders, the merchants, tradespeople, and ordinary residents whose savings were denominated in a currency that had just been quietly devalued by an act of foreign generosity. Cairo received the most concentrated and therefore most documented disruption. But Cairo was not the only point of impact. The caravan's route took it through numerous trading settlements along the trans-Saharan corridors. At each, Musa distributed. At each, the local gold supply increased suddenly. The markets along this route were smaller than Cairo, less diversified, and less able to absorb a monetary shock. In some cases, the caravan may have effectively purchased entire stocks of available goods, leaving local populations with gold they could not immediately spend and bare shelves. The historian Timothy Insull has noted that the economic geography of trans-Saharan trade in the 14th century was characterized by relatively small, specialized market nodes, towns that existed primarily to facilitate the exchange of specific goods between caravans and local producers. These nodes were not built for monetary shocks. They were built for steady, predictable flows of exchange. Mansa Musa's caravan was neither steady nor predictable. The Mamluk historian al-Makrizi, writing in the following century and drawing on earlier accounts, described the disruption with a phrase that economists of a later era might recognize: the market could not find its balance. Prices moved but could not settle. Merchants who had bought at inflated prices could not sell at profit sufficient to cover their costs. The commercial rhythms of the corridor were dislocated. There is a further complication that historians have noted. Musa's caravan was not only a distributor of gold. It was also a buyer. Thousands of people, moving through markets for months, needed food, water, fodder for animals, leather goods, cloth, and services of every kind. The demand shock this created was real and immediate. Prices for necessities along the route rose as demand outstripped local supply. This is a distinct mechanism from the currency devaluation effect in Cairo, but it operated simultaneously and reinforced it. The caravan was, in economic terms, a mobile demand surge combined with a monetary supply shock. The two effects layered on one another, and the regions through which the caravan passed bore both at once. The historical record suggests that Mansa Musa, either through his own observation or through the counsel of his advisors, became aware of the disruption his generosity had caused. Whether this awareness was precise, a clear recognition of the monetary mechanism at work, or more intuitive, a sense that markets along his route were in distress, cannot be determined from surviving sources. What the sources do record is an attempt at correction. Al-Amari and al-Makrizi both report that on his return journey, Musa borrowed gold from the merchants of Cairo at significant rates of interest. Some accounts suggest rates that were high even by the standards of medieval moneylending, which typically operated without the constraints of canonical prohibition on usury. The purpose of this borrowing was, as Al-Amari describes it, to withdraw gold from circulation, to reverse, at least partially, the monetary injection he had made on the outbound journey. This is a remarkable episode, and it deserves careful reading. Mansa Musa, a man who controlled, by reasonable historical estimate, more gold than any individual on the planet, chose to borrow gold at interest to reduce the quantity of gold in circulation. He was, in effect, engaging in what a modern central banker would recognize as monetary contraction. He was attempting to tighten the money supply. The economists reading this history will immediately notice the irony. The instrument of correction was borrowing, which, in any monetary system, creates future obligations. Musa borrowed gold that he would, in theory, repay. He was deferring the monetary impact rather than eliminating it. And borrowing at high interest meant that the total stock of gold in the regional economy was not simply withdrawn but redistributed toward the lenders, who presumably held it rather than spending it immediately. The effectiveness of this intervention is, to say the least, uncertain. The evidence that prices in Cairo remained elevated for over a decade after Musa's visit suggests that the borrowing-back strategy did not restore the pre-1324 equilibrium. It may have accelerated the return to stability. It may have been economically negligible. The sources do not permit a precise evaluation. What the episode does reveal is something historically unusual. A pre-modern ruler attempting, however clumsily, to manage the macroeconomic consequences of his own actions. There is no exact parallel in the medieval record. The closest analogues are the currency debasements that European monarchs periodically inflicted on their own economies, though those were typically intentional acts of fiscal extraction rather than belated corrective measures. Musa's borrowing-back operation demonstrates that he understood, at some level, that wealth in circulation behaves differently from wealth in storage. He had learned, at Cairo's expense, that the act of spending at scale was not equivalent to the act of possessing at scale. The possession of gold was private and bounded. The circulation of gold was public and consequential. It is a lesson that would not be formally theorized until centuries later, and that still generates political controversy in modern debates about monetary policy. Mansa Musa arrived at a version of it empirically, through the blunt instrument of his own mistake. The paradox at the heart of Mansa Musa's story is not, in the end, a paradox of personality. It is a paradox of scale. Wealth, at the level of an individual or a small institution, is straightforwardly beneficial, to its holder, to those who receive it, to the markets through which it moves. A wealthy merchant who spends freely is good for the merchants he buys from. A generous patron of the arts enables creation that would not otherwise exist. A rich traveler who tips well is welcomed everywhere. But wealth at a sufficient scale interacts with economic systems differently. It stops being a participant in markets and starts being a force that reshapes them. The economic historian Joel Moker has written about the concept of structural power, the capacity to alter the conditions within which other actors make decisions, rather than simply being one actor among many. Mansa Musa, in Cairo, was not spending within a market. He was reshaping it. Every transaction he made changed the context within which every subsequent transaction occurred. This is the precise point at which the economic paradox becomes visible. The same quality that made Musa's wealth impressive, its scale, its concentration in a single actor, made it dangerous when released into economies too small or too rigid to absorb it. Consider the supply and demand dynamics in concrete terms. The demand for gold as a store of value, its desirability as an asset, depends significantly on its scarcity. Gold is valuable partly because it is difficult to produce in large quantities and because its total global supply increases slowly. When Musa arrived in Cairo, he temporarily and locally overrode that scarcity. The gold supply in Cairo was not, for a period, scarce. It was abundant. And abundance, by the logic of markets, reduces value. There is a further dimension of the paradox that deserves examination: the question of intentionality. Was Mansa Musa aware that his generosity would cause economic disruption? The honest answer is that we do not know, and the sources do not tell us. Alamari's account does not present Musa as a man indifferent to the consequences of his actions. It presents him as generous, pious, and broadly attentive to the political and diplomatic dimensions of his journey. But piety and political sophistication are not the same as monetary economics. The conceptual framework for understanding how money supply affects prices was not fully developed in 14th century Islamic scholarship, though the early elements were present in Ibn Khaldun's work, which was written approximately a generation after Musa's reign. Musa could not have been expected to apply an analytical framework that did not yet exist in its complete form. What we can say is this: the disruption was not deliberate. It was the unintended consequence of rational behavior, generosity, piety, political display, operating at a scale that the economic systems of the time could not accommodate without breaking. And this is perhaps the most instructive aspect of the story, because it is the aspect that generalizes beyond the medieval world. Economic disruptions caused by rational actors making individually sensible decisions, without awareness or regard for systemic effects, are not historical curiosities. They are a recurrent feature of economic life. The financial crisis of 2008 involved rational actors, mortgage lenders, investment banks, rating agencies, each making locally defensible decisions that, in aggregate, created a systemic catastrophe that none of them individually intended. The tragedy of the commons, the overuse of shared resources by self-interested individuals acting rationally, is another expression of the same structure. Mansa Musa was a 14th century case study in what economists would later call a systemic risk, a risk that arises not from any single actor's error, but from the interaction between rational individual behavior and the structural properties of a complex system. The system, in his case, was the gold-based monetary economy of the medieval Islamic world. The rational individual behavior was a generous pilgrimage giving. The interaction produced a decade of inflation. There is a harder question embedded in the story, and it is worth asking directly. Was Mansa Musa's disregard for the economic consequences of his journey a form of power? Not power exercised through violence or coercion, though he commanded sufficient military force to exercise that too. But power as indifference. Power as the freedom to act without accountability for systemic consequences. The merchants of Cairo had no recourse. The residents whose savings were devalued had no complaint they could file, no authority to whom they could appeal. Musa was a foreign sovereign, in transit, distributing gold from an empire too distant and too powerful to be held responsible by Mamluk legal or commercial institutions. The disruption he caused was, in a meaningful sense, without consequence for him. He returned to Mali. His treasury was diminished, though the sources suggest that his empire's gold production would have replenished it within years. His prestige was enhanced. His diplomatic relationships were deepened. Cairo bore the costs of his visit. Musa bore almost none of them. This asymmetry is not unique to the 14th century. Large economic actors, whether sovereign states, multinational corporations, or individuals of extreme wealth, routinely impose costs on smaller economies and communities that they do not bear themselves. The technical term in economics is negative externality, a cost imposed on parties who are not part of a transaction but who bear its consequences regardless. Whether Musa understood or cared about this asymmetry, the historical record does not say. What the record does say is that the asymmetry was real, that it was experienced acutely by the people and markets he passed through, and that it lasted. It would be a distortion to reduce Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to its economic disruptions. The journey also produced consequences of a different order. Musa returned from Mecca with a cohort of scholars, architects, and artists. Most famously the Andalusian poet and architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, who reportedly received 200 pounds of gold from Musa for the journey alone and who is credited, in historical accounts of varying reliability, with the construction of the Jingareber Mosque in Timbuktu. Whether al-Sahili introduced new architectural forms to the region or developed existing traditions is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. The historian Richard Laban has argued for a more nuanced reading of his contribution, but the mosque itself stands, and it stands as a monument to what wealth, deployed over years rather than days, can build rather than simply disturb. Musa invested heavily in Timbuktu's intellectual infrastructure. He funded the expansion of the Sankor Mosque into a major center of Islamic learning, a university, in the functional if not formal sense, that at its height may have enrolled tens of thousands of students. The manuscripts produced and preserved at Timbuktu, hundreds of thousands of documents covering theology, astronomy, mathematics, law, medicine, and history, represent one of the most significant bodies of pre-modern African scholarship in existence. The journey also made the Mali Empire visible to the world in an unprecedented way. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, produced by the major Can cartographer Abraham Cresques, depicts Mansa Musa as a central figure in the known world, seated on his throne, holding his golden orb, explicitly labeled as the richest and most noble king in all the land. This image circulated across Europe, shaping the mental geography of a generation of merchants, explorers, and monarchs. It is not coincidental that the century following Musa's pilgrimage saw increased European interest in finding direct sea routes to the sources of West African gold. The disruption in Cairo had made one thing unmistakably clear. Somewhere to the south, beyond the Sahara, there was gold in quantities that defied comprehension. The Portuguese voyages down the West African coast in the 15th century, the beginning of the age of European maritime expansion, were motivated in part by this knowledge. Musa's journey, in this reading, is one of the events that set in motion the consequential forces of early modern globalization. The diplomatic consequences were immediate and lasting. Musa's meetings with the Mamluk Sultan in Cairo established relationships between Mali and Egypt that shaped trade and correspondence for decades. His journey through North Africa announced the Mali Empire to courts and merchants who had known it, if at all, only as a rumor at the end of a very long trade route. The historian Michael Gomez has written that Musa's pilgrimage was, among other things, a declaration of Mali's place in the Islamic world, a statement that this empire south of the Sahara was not peripheral to the great centers of Islamic civilization but coequal with them. The scale of his generosity was, in this light, a form of cultural argument. He was not simply distributing gold. He was claiming a seat at the table that had, until 1324, been defined by Cairo, Baghdad, and the cities of the Mediterranean world. In this, he succeeded. The Mali Empire's name entered the written record of the Islamic scholarly world more extensively after 1324 than before. Ibn Battuta's famous visit to Mali in the 1350s, which produced the most detailed first-hand account of the empire in the medieval literary record, was itself a consequence of the empire's enhanced visibility. Cultural legacy and economic disruption are not equivalent categories, and they cannot simply be weighed against one another on a single scale. The merchants of Cairo who endured a decade of elevated prices were not compensated by the manuscripts of Timbuktu. The disruption and the legacy coexisted as consequences of the same journey, serving different people in different ways across different time horizons. The question posed at the beginning of this story was precise. Can wealth be so vast that the act of spending it becomes economically destructive? The historical record, read carefully, returns a precise answer. Yes, under specific conditions. Those conditions are worth naming. Destructive monetary effects occur when the scale of injection is large relative to the receiving economy. When the injection happens suddenly, without gradual absorption. When the receiving economy lacks the productive flexibility to expand supply in response to expanded demand. And when there is no mechanism for coordination, no institution, no policy framework, no reverse valve that can moderate the shock. Cairo in 1324 met all of these conditions. The medieval gold market was relatively inflexible. Gold production could not be expanded quickly in response to a price change. Cairo's goods markets could not rapidly increase supply. There was no central bank, no monetary authority, no policy tool. And the injection was both massive and sudden. The disruption was real, measurable, and prolonged. That is the historical record. But the historical record also shows that Cairo recovered. That the trade routes continued to function. The Mali Empire remained a major force in the global gold market for generations. The intellectual and diplomatic consequences of the journey were substantial and positive. Timbuktu became one of the great centers of pre-modern scholarship. History, in this case, declines to provide a clean moral. It provides instead a complex accounting of costs and benefits, of intentions and consequences, of acts that were simultaneously generous and destabilizing, visionary and careless. What Mansa Musa's story offers to anyone willing to examine it carefully is not a morality tale about the dangers of wealth. It is a case study in the relationship between scale and consequence, a demonstration that systems, whether economic, ecological, or social, have carrying capacities, and that actors who exceed those capacities, even with entirely benign intentions, can produce harms they did not anticipate and cannot fully repair. This is not a medieval lesson. It is a structural one. The debates in contemporary economics about wealth concentration, about the systemic effects of large capital movements, about the ability of monetary systems to absorb shocks from actors operating at sovereign or near-sovereign scale. These debates draw on visible mechanisms, in a simpler form, on the road from Mali to Mecca in 1324. The question Mansa Musa's journey poses to every subsequent era is not whether he was good or bad, wise or reckless, pious or vain. He was, by the evidence available, all of these in various measures. The question is whether the systems through which wealth moves are designed, or can be designed, to handle the forces that extreme concentration generates when it is finally, inevitably, released. That question remains open. It was opened in Cairo in 1324. It is open now. The gold that Mansa Musa distributed in Cairo reportedly kept the price of gold depressed in the region for more than a decade after his departure. Ahmad ibn Yahya al-Amari, Masalik al-Absar, c. 1337.